We are delighted to start with our first session, but before we do, we would like to thank our sponsors, our title partner Z, in association with Rajnigandha Silver Pearls, powered by Airtel, our venue partners Google, Ford, Mahindra Humanities Center, and our media partners Patrika Group, Red FM, Dainik Bhaskar, DNA, and Twitter. We begin our first session. Total recall the end of privacy with our speakers, Homi K. Bhabha, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Niyam Bhushan, and Dayanita Singh. Before we begin the panel discussion, I would like to do a short introduction of our four speakers present here today. Pratap Bhanu Mehta is the president of the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. He previously taught political theory at Harvard and at NYU Law School. He has published widely on political theory, India's political economy and law, and his forthcoming books include The Oxford Companion to the Indian Constitution and The Burden of Toleration. He also serves as editorial consultant for the Indian Express and is a recipient of the 2011 Infosys Prize and the 2010 Adhisheshya Prize. Homi K. Bhabha is the Anne F. Rothenberg Professor of the Humanities, Director of the Mahindra Humanities Center and Senior Advisor to the President and Provost at Harvard University. He is a leading cultural and literary theorist and the author of numerous works exploring post-colonial theory, cultural change and power, cosmopolitanism, human rights, and various other themes, including in his seminal work, The Location of Culture. His forthcoming books will include a collection of essays on contemporary diasporic artists and another on cultural security and globalization. He has been published most recently in Critical Inquiry and is also a trustee of the UNESCO World Report on Cultural Diversity and holds honorary degrees from universities Paris 8, University College London, Free University Berlin, and in 2012 he was conferred the Government of India's Padma Bhushan Presidential Award in the field of literature and education and received the Humboldt Research Prize in 2015. Dayanita Singh is an artist. Her medium is photography and the book is her primary form. She has published 12 books: Zakir Hussain, Myself, Mona Ahmad, Privacy, Chairs, Go Away Closer, Center Letter, Blue Book, Dream Villa, Dayanita Singh, House of Love, File Room, and Museum of Chance. Lastly, Niyam Bhushan, as one of India's leading design thinkers, is currently kickstarting a revolution in design and in design think for India's vibrant startup, IT, and publishing culture. In just 1 year, he has single-handedly consulted over 100 startups and corporates across 8 locations in India, conducted over 27 workshops on design, and mentored dozens of professionals. His clients in the past have included Apple, Adobe, Google, Xerox, Darling, Kindersley, Living Media, and Pratham Books. He comes from a family background in publishing and writing, and while in college, he co-founded his first business in 1985 in turnkey digital publishing with prestigious international clients. As a veteran Indian journalist, he has been a contributing editor to Hindustan Times, Mint newspaper, former editor of PC World magazine, editor-in-chief and CEO of Chip magazine, and contributing editor to Linux For You magazine. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have our first session begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and a pleasure that we all owe very much to the collaboration between the Jaipur Literary Festival and the Mahindra Humanities Center at Harvard. In particular, I want to thank my colleagues Sanjoy Roy, William Dalrymple, and in fact Namita Gokhale, because without Namita, who has lost her voice but not her cosmic energy, this session would not really have taken place, and the continuation of the theme of privacy across various languages and cultures through the festival would not have happened. So Namita, you know, I very much wanted you here. You don't feel up to it today, but I'm glad to have you in the audience and eternally grateful to you for what you do every year for this collaboration. Thank you very much. When I proposed this idea of a series on privacy running through the festival, there were two texts that I just read which were in my mind, and I want to give you a brief taste of them. One is the very well-known 1890s Harvard Law Review piece by Justice Brandeis and his collaborator on the right to privacy. A work that returns again and again in every discussion really around the world on the legal aspects of privacy. And he says there, and I choose this particular quote because he talks about a photograph, Dayanita, and this is to cue you into this debate. Clearly, Justice Brandeis was thinking about you at that point. If casual and unimportant statements in a letter, if handiwork, however inartistic and valueless, if possessions of all sorts are protected, not only against reproduction, but against description and enumeration, how much more should the acts and sayings of a man or a woman, I've added of a woman, he says of a man, in his social and domestic relations be guarded from ruthless privacy? If you may not reproduce a woman's face photographically without her consent, how much less should be tolerated the reproduction of her face, her form, and her actions by graphic descriptions colored to suit a gross and depraved imagination. Now, that's in 1890. In 2013, in the New Yorker, Jill Lepore had something to say which I think attaches closely as a response almost about 120 years later to Justice Brandeis. She says, there is a paradox in the culture of our time, obsessed at once with being seen and with being hidden, a world in which the only thing more cherished than privacy is publicity. In this world, we chronicle our lives on Facebook while demanding the latest and best form of privacy protections, ciphers of numbers and letters, so that no one can violate the selves we have so entirely contrived to expose. So this idea that on the one hand, we want all the most technical forms of protection, but we ourselves are exchanging our privacy for a kind of publicity. And this brings me to the first point. I just wanted to list a few issues here, that the question of privacy, the public and the private, is not only a spatial metaphor about society or legality, about law, it's very much about how we conceive to be the boundaries of personhood. Who is a person in our time? What is a person? How much of us is involved in this exchange between the private and the public? Another aspect, of course, of this is the notion of what in the public realm should be kept private. And here, of course, you begin to have the debates around discrimination, the politics of identity, people who claim and demand, controversially, the notion of safe spaces in the public domain. So I think we've got to think the private ethic within the public social domain. And of course, in India at the moment, we have, all kinds of policing, moral policing, food policing, things that we thought were ours to choose, defining our private lives, suddenly become public issues. Are you eating beef? Are you in a hotel room as an adult with somebody of your choice? Is this right? Is this wrong? And you know that the film Masan very much takes up this whole issue and the tragic nature of this issue. Then, of course, there's the question, one that Jill Lepore touches on, that we exchange so much information in the public sphere, in social media. Social media is not only informational, it's associational. It creates new forms of community. And yet, how fragile are we becoming? How vulnerable are we to those who enter that domain with a deliberate, disruptive, humiliating, there are many cases in the United States now where people unknowingly have actually been made the center of police investigation. They don't know. They're in a chat book, they're having a conversation. Suddenly the police turn up and they say somebody on the social media tipped off the police saying, go and investigate X or Y. There was a large article in the New York Times recently about the way in which people's lives have been destroyed and ruined in that way, and I know you want to say something about it. And finally, just a thought, and a controversial thought. And this comes out of the whole Snowden affair. And when I read Greenwald's book on Snowden, Snowden was portrayed quite rightly and portrayed himself, represented himself as basically a protector of individual privacy. And there seemed to be something both extraordinarily important about that, and there seemed to be something extraordinarily retrograde about it at the same time. If all if the stakes of the whole thing are only to protect individual privacy, then I really did feel that this trade-off between his remarkably brave and courageous acts in revealing what was happening in surveillance in the United States, there has to be something more than individual privacy. Individual privacy is a bedrock value, but there is something more about justice within the community, the sense of transparency. There had to be a value more than privacy. Whereas the portrayal of Snowden has been so focused on the rights of the individual. Central, but I would suggest not entirely enough in that respect. So these were the issues with which I initially proposed that we should have a thematic running through the festival. I'm very grateful to you for joining me, and I think we might actually turn to some of your concerns with privacy, as they may or may not speak to some of these issues. So, Dayanita, why not start with you? Tell us.
Well, I'm in the most obvious situation with privacy, because that is a dilemma with photography, that there is really no solution. In fact, when I couldn't bear it anymore and the dilemma of violating people's privacy repeatedly, that's when I really started photographing empty spaces, because I thought maybe there won't be this kind of intrusion and invasion there. There are two levels of violation of privacy in photography. One is when you are making the photograph or taking the photograph, however collaborative it may be. The second is the usage of it, in where I just posted your picture on Instagram and you were smiling. I could have hashtagged it whatever I liked, and that's how it would go out into the world. So this used to happen in photography even before any of the digital media started, where wrong captions would give the wrong information. And it was such a dilemma for me that when I made my book of family portraits, I called it privacy because I thought I'm really violating each person's privacy. I've gone into their home. I've made pictures of them in quite a sort of vulnerable setting, however collaborative I tried to make it. So I called the book Privacy because of that reason, but also because I felt, I tried to ask around that there was no word in Hindi for privacy. And then I thought, when did the idea of privacy start? And how come we don't have an accurate word for privacy in Hindi? So does that mean it was somehow a non-Indian concept? And I really wonder, Pratap, about when does the idea of privacy start?
Okay, a couple of things. So one, I think the obvious point, which is, under the umbrella of privacy, there's a whole series of concerns. And I'm a bit wary about these translation points, because it used to be said Hindi does not have a word for thank you, so we don't have a concept of gratitude.
Ah, right.
There are different components to it. I mean, the idea of privacy that connotes the desire for solitude, control, you could say, is ekant and so forth. So privacy is historically variable and specific. But I think one way of answering your question, and I guess this is what I want to maybe perhaps put on the table, and why I think we are at the end of an era in thinking about privacy, is, so, Snowden happened, there was the recent hacking of the State Department, the federal employees records data, Aadhaar is happening in India, and the big puzzle is, people are trying to get people agitated about privacy, and there is no political traction, right? So let me start with that puzzle. Are we really concerned about privacy in the classic sense? And I would submit not really, because there are 4 or 5 things that emanate from what we want as a society, going to your collective conception of justice, that are fundamentally at odds with the notion of privacy. And these are the things we actually like. I mean, the cases of sort of beef bans and so forth are the easy cases, because they clearly violate some notion of choice. But what about the intrusions on privacy that come from the choices we actually exercise? So the first impulse is accountability, right? The kind of privacy that a society has will depend on what kind of accountability regime it is signing up to. Who should be accountable to whom for what? Ironically, the Brandeis-Warren article was actually meant to protect private spaces for public officials. But if you are now accountable in a health system for how much sugar you consume, right? If all private persons have become public persons because your tax returns have huge implications for the economy, the very impulse to accountability will, in a sense, colonize the space for privacy. And so the issue is, who draws that political boundary of accountability? The second deep impulse, traditionally our worry about surveillance and privacy used to come from an Orwellian imagination, right? People, holders of power, will use information to extinguish desire. Actually, the opposite has happened. I mean, one of the amazingly creative things about this technological environment is that it actually, in a sense, uses surveillance and technology to provide you what you want, right? This kind of, our desires make us complicit in this regime of surveillance and technology. So it's not Orwell's worry that, this will be a bleak, joyless world, regulated by big state power. It's actually quite the opposite. It's this exuberant world of sharing, right? And the third and final thing, which is something we want, is, the obvious point in a kind of post-Foucault age, which is the desire for knowledge will by itself militate against the idea of privacy, right? When Dave Eggers said privacy is theft, right? Quite a clever pun on the idea that property is theft. The idea behind it was that almost everything we do, right? There's that Enlightenment impulse, is in principle amenable to a form of knowledge, even if you don't want to use that knowledge for control, right? Law interrogates us at every point. It enters private spaces to secure justice. Medicine, in a sense, invades us, right? So there is this whole rise of the disciplines that in their very formation, right, where the premise is that everything is knowable. And if you are resisting being known, you are actually withholding something from the production of knowledge, right? So the challenge for us, Homi, is that the things we want, accountability, knowledge, and satisfaction of desire, these are the things that, in a sense, trap us in this kind of attack on privacy.
But that's very clarifying. I'm going to come to you in a minute. But the whole nature of desire, right, human desire, is that it is not entirely self-aware. Right. And that's the issue. The issue is, yes, we do desire these things. In the biopolitical idea is that our bodies are becoming the basis of knowledge. But there is still something that militates against it, and that is the awareness that we may be trapped, to use your very word. Right. So even within this large public domain of the of offering ourselves, or offering up our privacy for certain goods and services that we have, even within that, I would say there are certain areas where something militates and people want to hold on to the idea of privacy. And in an interesting way, and I want to bring this to Dayanita, and then in an interesting way, Dayanita, the time, I remember those early photographs, which were rather like some of the earlier paintings of Nalini Malani, family groups in a way, at one level poised, at another level anxious, beautifully caught. But when you remove the people, domestic spaces and even the public spaces, the historic spaces, the Gandhi photograph, you somehow saw the trace
Yeah.
of the public in the private, even when the private, the personal had actually fled. And I think there's something in that, that very often our desire for privacy is not fully known to ourselves, and yet we know where it is violated.
Yeah.
So I want to turn to you with that paradox in mind.
True.
We can never know fully what it is that we desire.
Okay. So I want to share something with all of you in this hall right now. In the past 1 year or two, going across the buzzing startup culture of India, involved with design and design thing, I've hit against a wall every single time. Your privacy is being plundered exponentially. Every time you download an app, switch on your mobile, go to WhatsApp, it's incredible what's happening to you. So what I discovered even more intriguingly is that people in India do not understand privacy. As she rightly pointed out, we do not have the lexicon for it. The nearest word we have in India for privacy is parda. So I discovered the only time people in this room would understand privacy is if you live in a joint Indian family. At that time, you all have your issues. Don't say this to Bhabhi ji, and don't say this to Chacha ji, and so on, right? So here's a very interesting test. How many of you have WhatsApp installed? Look at this room. How many of you have Telegram Messenger installed?
Hardly
That's
any.
it. Hardly anybody. Now, how do you think Mark Zuckerberg is going to recoup his $19 billion? If not from this gold mine of your private, intimate, candid, honest, truthful conversations that you have, which Google's Eric Schmidt calls at the edge of creepiness. Do you know, we are no longer honest in our relationships with one another and with each other. We are not even honest with God today in the temples and the churches and synagogues. But the only place left in the world for you to be brutally honest today is in the search engine of Google. You ask anything and seek anything that you want from there. But did you know Google is watching you as well? Do you realize what gives birth to privacy? It is not the social mores, because privacy has always been a shifting target through cultures and people, and even in your moment-to-moment existence. For example, in India, it was taboo to think that you would ever go to the toilet or the restroom with someone, correct? It would be a sacrilege. But look at what's happening at airports. Everybody walks in together into public toilets, which was unheard of in this culture. So privacy is a shifting target, and now somebody would get offended if you said that I would not accompany you to the toilet when you're going there, and so forth. In the earlier days, you could only eat your food in private. Now we have a whole culture of restaurants and lounges, and people want to be seen eating with others and so forth. So I have thought very keenly on behalf of India, as we are at the cusp of the cultural revolution which will impact the world through design from India. What is privacy if our ancient culture cannot express it? What would? I've spent more than 1 year thinking, and here's the only thing that I've discovered. Privacy is born with the birth of private thoughts in you at whatever age that happens. That moment when you hold on to a private thought, maybe funny, maybe ludicrous, maybe ridiculous, maybe tragic, maybe sacrilegious, but you decide not to communicate. You have given birth to what I call your individual privacy. Henceforth, you will be in conflict with society and culture, and from now onwards, you will eternally be in conflict if you do not have a curated conversation over the digital cultural tsunami sweeping across the world, because the internet has no delete button. Try to erase your past. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
There you go.
You know, just to take up the last point you made,
Right.
about private thoughts.
Right.
and, you know, the public expression. You know, I think that's an issue that goes a long way, because as soon as you start expressing the most private of your thoughts in public expression, you use language, you use discourse, you enter into kinds of institutions. See, my interest, and I think just picking up from you, is not that privacy has to be one particular kind of thing. It is always a shifting landscape of issues, and once it's a shifting landscape of issues, it doesn't, you know, I agree with the historical idea that in certain cultures at certain times you didn't have, you know, you wouldn't use the washroom together. The fact is now we do that, and yet we have a residue of privacy. There is a legal residue, there is a customary residue, there's a moral residue. So the fact that we get less private doesn't mean that we're not private at all. And I was wondering, Pratap or Dayanita, whether you see this paradox, that we've got to work with the paradox, not in a way against it.
Yeah, no, I actually think, I mean, we have no choice but to work with the paradox.
Yes.
That's in a sense always been. And therefore, in a sense, the question will always come down to one of institutional design and power, right? Because when we ask why do we value privacy, there are 3 or 4 different kinds of things, right? There's the question of solitude, right, which Naman just raised. That's one. There's the question of being able to control, which is another. There's a question of exercising choice, which in some senses is another. So how we negotiate this paradox cannot be, in a sense, an act of individual resistance alone.
That's right.
That has to be a public conversation around who gets to exercise power over whom. And in some senses, the challenge, I mean, you know, it depends on how much of a technological fatalist you are, but if you take Snowden's own account, right, I think to be fair to Snowden, there is the act of individual resistance. But he also does believe that technology will have to be made to work against itself to secure these kinds of spaces, right? That the worst thing we can do to ourselves is to kind of give into a kind of technological fatalism, right? That this process is so over-determined that the only idea of privacy you can hold on to is a solitude. But as the joke goes, even a secret is a secret only if you tell at least one person.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. That in a way, total solitude doesn't raise the question of privacy. It's because solitude can never be entirely encapsulated or encrypted in itself that we have it. As an artist, you said that you felt when you entered the homes of people and took portraits or family portraits, you felt that despite the contract you had with them, I'm using a contractual language, they knew what you were going to do, there was something you felt that you were violating or revealing that should have been kept secret. In your act of creativity, what was that something?
I think photography records what's in front of the camera, but at the best of times, it can record things that are unsayable, that don't have words, and that's photography at its best. And it was those kind of dynamics, tensions that photographs would reveal. And families, when I would take the photographs back to them, trying to be very fair in this contract, would say, but that's terrible, you make us look completely cold. We had a fight last night. But that became their record for their grandchildren, that cold, impersonal photo, if we decided to keep it there. I didn't find a solution for it, but even now, Pratap, we had Google Glass last year, no? 1 blink is a photo, 2 blinks is a video. So in that sense, one is a technology fatalist. What are we going to do? And maybe the only way I can protect myself is if I have a parda around me all the time, because you might have taken 20 pictures with each blink by now of me.
I'd like to add to that point, may I? This is a very valid thing. I've used Google Glass, and it's not my experience, but from anecdotal notes I've discovered, it's the best way for a man to be hit by a lady's handbag. You just have to wear a Google Glass and out comes a bag to hit you. So a couple of things. Taking on Pratap's point, how many of you have a Facebook account here? Well, there you are. Please understand, you've come here as victims of your privacy being violated. But what you do not realize is that you are first indulging in social voyeurism, which goes 100 times ahead of what she's talking about in a single photograph. You enter and invade the private lives of so many people, and you know what the game you're all playing, it's an addiction, it's dopamine. The game is, show me yours, I'm trying not to show you mine. And therefore, the whole idea of privacy is now a joke. And who's laughing to the bank? Zuckerberg. What you've got to understand is very simple. Do not expect a totalitarian regime or somebody to take control of freedom in the age of the individual. It has to be the individual who has to take control of their personal shifting target of privacy in their times. And both technology is amoral. We have technology that will invade your privacy, but even Moglen and Richard Stallman are giving birth to a new kind of the internet and the web called the freedom box, where they're saying all the errors and the mistakes and the blunders of privacy that have happened will now be taken care of. Look at Bitcoin. So you see, technology will be your slave, but you do not become a slave of technology.
Yeah, but you know,
Right.
I do think in this account you gave,
Right.
there is two things.
Right.
You're absolutely right to say that technology has certain powers that we don't have.
Right.
But we have not also surrendered our sovereignty. Maybe people are discovering new ways in which putting their private lives on Facebook and having certain kinds of connections through Facebook are giving them certain kinds of pleasures or speaking to desires.
It is known as a currency.
No, yeah, but I
Yes.
don't think we can be as black and white. I mean, I've heard your
course.
point on you know, as you've been making it.
True.
I just think that if we get into that kind of polarization, there is no way out of it.
Of course not.
And so I think what we've got to think is creatively,
Right.
wanting to surrender certain things. At different times, people surrendered different things. I mean, even in the 18th century epistolary novel, at a time when there was incredible convention about keeping the private lives of people separate, particularly between servants and masters, the whole 18th century novel was about servants talking about what was happening in the novel. And everybody, in their worlds, everybody read it. So I think the nature of privacy and choice and intention is more complicated than the behemoth of the machine and
Okay.
of technology. So perhaps we can spend some time now.
May I respond to this one?
Can I just,
Yes, please.
can we just spend some time to think how creatively
Yes.
we always work in the interstices of domination and freedom.
True.
There is no, freedom is a difficult thing. There is no total freedom. We continually work within institutional values and individual values. It's not a new thing. You know, maybe there is a magnification of it. So I would like us to try and think in the time we have,
True.
how we can creatively work between these things.
Right. So I just have a very small point, and over to you people. Through literature and the birth of the novel and everything that we have here, we've had archetypes of people. But this is the first time when you are the character in the novel. And it's your personal direct life which is out there, which is what has changed things, you see. And so this is where she brings her ideas of photography and you on your political things. So over to you people on how you look at the individual now as the protagonist.
Can I just say one thing to this?
Yes.
Actually, you know, that's not actually accurate.
Right.
Novels are not about archetypes. Novels started when people's intimate first-person diaries
True.
were the basis of the experience. That's how a lot of the fiction around the world, novelistic fiction, started. It was people who wanted to put out there their experience in a first-person narrative.
Okay.
So I'm saying when you use Facebook, you are not doing something that different. You're making a certain choice as to what to put out. What is a problem is that as soon as you put that out, you get 100 advertising things telling you what you should buy and what you shouldn't buy. I think that's a commercialization of it. But the very act of using Facebook is actually quite an old thing. The keeping of diaries, the publication of first-person narratives. So, Pratap, do you think, how could we work productively? Now, you know, given this dark scenario, how do we work productively to retrieve something of our own personal choice and ethics?
So I think the first and very boring step in this is to actually break down the problem into smaller pieces.
Break
I think
it.
we are talk of lots of very different kinds of problems.
Break it down.
And just to take a couple, right? So as I said, if one of the worries, and when we worry about things like Facebook and so forth, right, it's not just the fact that some things are being made public. It's the fact that you don't have control over those representations. You don't know what will be done to them. You don't know the context in a sense in which they will be used. And maybe we are at a point with our culture in a sense where, look, any medium will survive or exert power use so long as it has a certain kind of credibility. I'm a little bit of an optimist in the sense that when there is access to a medium, there will in a sense be a kind of internal backlash against it. Like we stopped believing Indian media, for instance, right? At a certain, at a certain point when it began
Even also, or even in fact, the people need to know,
right,
the nation needs to know.
Especially the nation needs to know, right? It's the way in which society evolved protocols of dealing with gossip, right? Which was in a sense the classic form of violating the public and private sort of story. But what we do need, the two most important things, because fundamentally, right, the reason we worry about privacy is it's about ceding power to somebody else, right? And that power is coming in two forms. It's coming in the form of big corporations. I think that is an issue. So for example, I mean, if you take the notion of a kind of black box society that Frank Pasquale has written about, what are the algorithms that something like Google uses to actually shape the structure of desires and preferences? These will need to be placed in greater structures of accountability, right? The irony of our present moment is information is being made more public, but intellectual property and technology is being made more proprietary and private.
True, very good.
And it is the restoration of the balance between that is going to be in a sense very important. And for states which are using surveillance and so forth, it is what are the democratic structures of accountability. I don't think it will be a very helpful conversation to go through the technology fatalism route. It is what are the structures of accountability that will in a sense determine the ways in which particular information is actually used. And that conversation I think does give some room for creativity.
Yeah, and it is precisely to protect that accountability. Does the law have a major role necessarily in this whole process?
The law has a major role. In fact, the Brandeis article you cited was the beginning of, a century of jurisprudence. Yeah. But the law will have to keep up with the times. But more importantly, I think particularly in Indian context, more than law, it is state capacity. I mean, even with old technologies like phone tapping, very frankly, an omnibus order from a Home Secretary authorizing 5,000 phone taps in a single order was, in a sense, rule by law, not rule of law. So you will have to develop the kinds of state capacities, right, that are in a sense commensurate with this technological challenge. And that can't happen if the state is run by the average age of your bureaucrat looking at these things is about 50, whereas what you need is 17-year-olds protecting you from the future.
That's a very, very valid point here.
That's it. Dayanita.
Well, as an artist, and as quite a private person myself, I didn't give in to any of this till I started to play with Instagram. And so I'm just 1 year old in Instagram. But I realized that actually, for all that it takes from me, what it gives me is this dissemination of the image, and possibly it's a conversation I want to have with you later. As someone who is really a bookmaker, I can see the book, the photo book, the illustrated book, finding forms on Instagram. So I think artists, I am certainly working towards making my forms, and I make virtual museums on Instagram. So I don't put out private information about myself, but I'm trying to build forms out of what exists. Facebook, I find more gossipy, but Instagram, because it's the image, someone in China, someone in Russia, someone in Tamil Nadu, without speaking my language, understands my photograph. even someone who's not literate understands the photograph, and if they start following the hashtags of museum of legs, you know, I built an entire museum or started building a museum on Instagram. So I'm sort of saying it's up to me what information I put out, but here's a form, I want to work with that. I want to build something out of that form.
So this really does respond to my question. There are ways in which you can harness these technologies for your purpose. The question is not, you know, with respect, Pratap, you said we don't know, we don't know. There are lots of things that we don't know. We may say things, we may do things, we may write articles. We don't know how they're going to be read or interpreted. But I think the problem is that there we know that we may be misinterpreted. Right. The problem with technology is when we do not even know that our information is being wrought, sought, surveyed, and administratively held. That's the problem of transparency, and I think that's Snowden's big point. Not that, you know, there's a way of saying, now we know that we do not know something, but we don't even know that we do not know. This is almost a Freudian problem.
Right. True. So here, this is to answer his question specifically. You know, on YouTube, for example, I believe there's 50,000 hours of video being loaded per second. So there is no way you can do anything. And Kapil Sibal tried the IT Act of 2011 and tried very hard to try to see how to handle and moderate this thing. What we've seen in the interest of commerce and business, companies have tried to become self-conscious about privacy and other issues, which of course is also not absolutely fair to the end user, but at least it's a start. So Facebook, YouTube, and everybody is doing this. Second, look carefully. Twitter is one wild thing. She talks about the visual media. Twitter is the digital graffiti wall of the world, right? And it has got a powerful impact in just 144 characters. And even they don't know how to control this media. News on Twitter travels faster than an earthquake, as you know very well. So, as we said, technology is amoral. And the second thing, what we could do, small steps. All of you must have got bugged by all these telephone calls to buy or from banks or everything that happened in India because there's no regulation. So one day, using design thinking, I went deep into it and I discovered that the value of your data exists as long as your data is accurate. The moment they discover that your data is dud, they chuck it and you could reclaim a little beachhead of your privacy. So what I've started to do is quite funny, and if you feel like you can do this, if, say for example, State Bank of India calls me, I tell them call me at my other number, which is the number of, let's say, Corporation Bank who had called me earlier. And then when Corporation Bank calls me, I say, by the way, call me at my other number, which is probably Corporation Bank. So soon they discover that this individual has these 4 numbers, and they can go call one another and leave me in peace. Okay, and I call this the Quit Databasing India movement. I wrote about this 14 years ago. It's like the Dundee March for your digital privacy and freedom. And I think this little act of subversion is so beautiful. It's like an individual hack all of you can do. But of course, these are not the entire solution, because we don't even know, as he says, we don't even know what we don't know. But there you are.
But the irony is his subversion is now public on
Yeah.
Instagram.
But that's beautiful. They can't
Unless
fix
you
it.
make it public, you don't know it's subversive. You're
Say
right.
the paradox.
Now, yes, that's why we work with the paradox. But there is a question. You said a couple of times now,
Right.
the technology is amoral.
Right.
One could say the same thing about language.
true, it
Language, technology is a particular language, a particular communicative form. Language is amoral.
Right.
But yet we have a framework or matrices of norms and moralities with which we infuse language. And this is, I think, where the question of transparency comes in. It's an old-fashioned word, but I think it's an important word. The trouble is that with the virtual form of technology, which is in a sense almost invisible, the question of transparency becomes even more problematic. You see, if you're thinking within a corporation or within an institution of certain rules and regulations, etc., then you can actually even know where to put the pressure on transparency. But in this kind of virtual, manipulative virtual realm, and I use that phrase, showing that technology is not amoral because it can be manipulative, it can conceal itself.
Okay.
That's the problem. Where do we go for transparency?
True.
But I think one of the things we have achieved here in this conversation, short though it is that there are these moments in between technology and individual choice or intention which have a very creative use, other than the fact that there's a whole knowledge world that we can retrieve. But I know, Pratap, you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, just the kind of the most obvious point of this, which is, just like there's a myth, right, that markets just exist. Markets don't exist. Architecture has to be created for markets to exist.
Exactly.
And I think it is important to remember, and I think that's one of the points that Snowden was also making, that this virtual world also has an architecture. It's an architecture that's been created by a whole series of conventions and institutions, whether it's the debate over ICANN, whether it's the privacy rights we grant Google not to really reveal their algorithms of, in a sense, what they're doing. And I think the real issue is it possible to engage with that architecture, to wrest from that architecture these moments of protected spaces?
I'd like to immediately respond to that, because you're both talking about transparency and you're saying you don't know what's happening. So basically it's like saying, I want to take control of my health, but I don't know the recipe of what I'm eating because it comes in a tin can, right? And the answer in the computer industry has been there since 1985. The best way to know what you think you do not know and you should know is free and open source software, right? And the irony here is that Google knows everything about you. You do not know the software of Google, what it knows about you. It should be free and open source. And slowly, the wisdom of free and open source software is coming in to make technology accountable, given that it is amoral and that it should be trying to do something about it, right? Now, in every facet of it, you don't know what your mobile phone is doing. Did you know, for example, that Facebook actually switches on the microphone every random few minutes and listens in to your conversations, and you have consented to this? Did you know that your webcam switches on and off, and it just looks at you? Now banks are saying that instead of having you log in with a password, without your consent we'll switch on the camera because you said yes somewhere, and we'll know who's logged in. So basically the only solution to this kind of technological stuff is if you know what's in the recipe. Only then can you take the first step.
Yeah.
And nobody talks about free and open source software.
But that is, in fact, as I see it, where the debate now is. That these things that are not transparent should be made transparent. And this is also a slow process. You get one leak, and then you begin to understand how this is, how the system works. But there is something else that I want to just bring up before we end with technology. And I think that technology is also like a game. We talk about desire. People love the risk, even at the risk of revealing something, just as in human relations, you know, we can't make them safe. Risk is the game. Risk is what drives us to creativity. Risk is what makes us fall in love. We don't fall in love because we're sure that this is going to last. We first fall in love and then we decide whether it's going to last or not, and then we fall in love again. So my issue really is, we've got to infuse this amoral, machine-like structure with art, with creativity. We've got to ask questions of desire, questions of risk, questions of accountability, and understand also that human side of the technology, what it taps into, our fantasies. You know, so much of Facebook is fantasy. And that in itself is not something that we can control, because fantasy has been so much a part of art, it's been a part of culture. So the more we think of technology or the culture of technology, I think the more we are going to understand that these human aspects of it will somehow become the platform of a further interrogation. Should be open to the public.
Yeah, absolutely.